I'm Eric McGrew, and this is Off-Road Independence.
This is episode 35 of Off-Road Independence. This podcast is brought to you by beginnersfab.com, the site that teaches you how to make useful, interesting, and creative things with basic tools. Think you don't have the fabrication tools necessary to make what you need? Think again. beginnersfab.com. Hey everybody, this is Eric with Off-Road Independence, and today I want to bring to you a new site. It's called banhammer4x4.com, and this site really looks like it's going to be something cool for the off-road community. What is it? Well, it's a bunch of stuff, but the part that I really like is the product reviews here. Why so? Because if you go down here and you look in here, you see a basic description of it. You get a rating at the top left that talks about the value and the function of it. And then down you see it has strengths, weaknesses, and the overall idea of it. And if you go down here to where I'm at, you can click on those who have reviewed the product and you get to see their profile. You can actually see things such as their ride or their vehicle that they're using, all the specs of their vehicle, and you also get to see what it was built for and what they would do differently. That gives you a realistic review that can be very close to what you're looking for. That's really cool. To be able to do this though, go by banhammer4x4.com, go over here, it'll say log in for you, register there, and then you can set up your own profile and start helping this community grow. Off-Road Independence is the proud sponsor of Oregon Trail Off-Road. Stewards of the Trail, ambassadors of adventure. Don't know who they are? Stop by and check them out at OregonTrailOffroad.com. Not only that, but you'll be able to see their first 3 episodes of their web series, One Lane Road, and check them out as they continue to progress and organize themselves for their ultimate adventure. Not only that, but you'll be able to see on their site how you can help them out, and if nothing else, you'll just be able to hang out and enjoy the ride. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Off-Road Independence. I'm glad that you guys are here with us again. I've got John Cappa on the show. We'll have a show as long as I can tolerate him, and that's getting shorter and shorter by the month.
And that's it.
And we're done. No, today we're going to talk a little bit, honestly, I don't know what we're talking about because
fuel systems.
Yeah, fuel systems, and that kind of relates a little bit into power mods, but not like complete power mods. So it'll be a little bit of mix of a couple of things, but we'll focus mainly on the fuel system stuff. And once again, I know that a lot of guys want to listen to shows and stuff, or they read articles and magazines, and they're like, "Oh, why don't you talk about details?" And well, the reason that me and John don't talk about details is because, well, that would take forever to cover anything that most people would want to hear. We'd have to talk about how many different kinds of vehicles. I mean, it's just really hard to do.
Yeah, every vehicle's different with a fuel system.
So instead of that, we're going to go into principles, and we're going to talk about 3 basic things. One is why or what you may want to use a standard, OEM fuel system with, or how or why. 2, when you want to start mixing a fuel system between aftermarket performance parts, right, with a standard operating, fuel system.
Like if you're doing an engine swap.
Yeah, and then 3rd is if you want to go a full performance fuel system, which we'll talk about all of
everything.
Yeah, all of these things, and then the pros and cons and what you need to kind of keep in mind with all that stuff. However, before we get started with that, I'd like to give a couple of shout outs to some people who have been really great to me personally. I don't really care who John wants to give shout outs to. It's not his show, it's mine.
Hi, Mom.
So I would like to give a big shout out to Michael, who works at Warren Winch. He's got me what I needed information wise and some stickers as far as giving me the components I need. Yep, there you go. For my winch rebuild that I'm doing, that'll be up in the show earlier. Hey man, no vibrating of the phones on the podcast. What's going on with you, man? And
sorry, you got a text message.
And then the other guy that I'd like to, or the other guys I'd like to give a shout out to are Oregon Trail Off-Road. They sent me this cool swag that I got on here. So that's nice of them. I really appreciate it. It's really a help, especially with this hoodie where I live. It's going to come in handy with all the cold weather. So thanks, everybody. Now, to kind of get into the show again, John is actually working on a project right now, which is his GPW project, right?
My flat fender, yeah. It's got a 4.3 liter V6 and a GM engine. And basically, you had to build the whole fuel system from scratch, essentially.
So that's kind of going to be the basis of what we're talking about in where this all started from. But John has more experience with fuel systems than I do. So we're going to talk about general applications of fuel systems. And some things may relate directly to John's because that's what he's working on right now. And then others will just be in general terms. So that's where we stand as far as the show goes. So one thing that John and I talked about when we did our last show is John was like, I can't believe how much money I spent on parts for this fuel system, right? I mean,
I can believe it, but I can't believe it.
Yeah.
I don't want to believe it. So, yeah, I don't even have, not including, I thought about it this morning. Let me put it this way. So I thought about it this morning. So, the inexpensive fuel cells that you can buy for a couple of $100 are only about half the price of what you need to spend on your entire fuel system. So you can get the fuel cell, but then you're going to spend another double that price, and then you could finish your fuel system out. This is what I figured out. Well, it could be more than that depending on how big a fuel line you need and stuff. But typically, you're running like a -6 or a -8 AN line. And the fittings, the hoses, and the pump, and all that stuff is going to cost you about double what a fuel cell costs.
So there you go. Well, once again, understand he's talking about the application of a fuel cell. So
right, with fuel injection. So
Yeah.
you're spending more on the hose and the pump and all that.
But now that brings up a question, I guess, and I'm a practical guy, I would say. I'm a little cheap, but I'm definitely practical.
Welcome to the club.
And so but there has to. I see trends, right? And that's how off-roading is. It's like any other subculture or whatnot. There are trends. And it's like, for one moment, everybody's talking about making the best use of your OEM fuel system and how you can modify that to give you more power or whatever. And then all of a sudden, it's like everybody's going to full-on race fuel cells, and everybody's got to have one in their vehicle. You know what I mean?
I don't look at it as a modification that you do because you think it's cool. Usually putting a fuel cell in involves either A, you need more fuel capacity, and this is an easy way to get it because factory fuel tanks are usually sizes that just won't fit in whatever area you have, whereas a fuel cell is usually a square or a rectangle, and it can typically fit in a spot that you need. And then there's really no performance addition. You're not going to go faster because you have a fuel cell, but you're going to have more ground clearance if you can move the fuel tank away from the underside of the vehicle. Or I think that those are the main reasons for going with a fuel cell. If you're and lengthening the wheelbase of, say, a Jeep, and it's got a rear-mounted gas tank, the gas tank's in the way. You got to move it somewhere, and a fuel cell kind of gives you an inexpensive way that actually looks halfway decent, rather than throwing a factory, ugly-looking gas tank in the back of your Jeep.
Yeah, and now, there are specific applications where a fuel cell is just a requirement if you're building a race vehicle for turnover and all that kind of stuff. But
typically those fuel cells are generally more expensive than some of the the sportsman type fuel cells.
Yeah, and those typically have like special baffling inside them and all that kind of stuff.
Baffling and a bladder, a flexible bladder, and the bladder has to be replaced like every 2 years or something. They're not cheap fuel cells.
Yeah, so that's a good point though, right there, John. Let's kind of start with that. If you're going to use a fuel cell for relocation, don't go buy the most expensive fuel cell because you don't really need it, right?
Yeah, unless you're a safety fanatic, then you could go ahead and do that, and you're okay with. But it's just going to be a more high maintenance item than a standard fuel tank.
Yeah. So what we can definitely say is that there are 3 segments, like I mentioned briefly before. There's the OEM fuel system, which came in the vehicle, right? And those can be adapted and modified a little bit, typically for different uses. Then you have a mix, OEM fuel injectors, lines, filters, that kind of stuff, but with a fuel cell for relocating.
For convenience, sure.
And then there's the full-on high performance race, whatever fuel system where all the lines, all the fittings, all the fuel cell, all the injectors and all that, the rails are all different now, right?
Right, and they have to meet a lot of that stuff will have to meet some sort of race requirements, some sort of standards, some sort of safety standard.
So, like, when it comes to the OEM systems, right? Typically speaking, what's like a max horsepower that, I mean, you like, at this point, I got to go to a full custom fuel system.
It's going to depend on the engine, right? So, like, if you start with a small engine and you throw a bunch of turbo at it, or a supercharger or something like that, and you're trying to get a ton of horsepower out of a smaller motor, then yeah, you're probably going to need bigger fuel lines relatively quickly because they come with really small fuel lines from the factory. But if we're just talking about V8s, you're around the 500, 600, 700 horsepower is when you're starting to have to get bigger fuel lines, more fuel pressure, more volume, all of that kind of stuff. So it's generally outside of most enthusiast off-road motors, but there's some guys that do run hot motors like that. So typically a 3/8 feed line is plenty for most of these 4x4s.
Yeah, and once again, it also depends on the vehicle itself, right? Because like my dad has an F-150 that I've mentioned before. It's got the 5.0 Mustang motor in it. It's short wheelbase, 4-wheel drive, and he has the fuel sending cell in the fuel tank, but then he's got the pressurized pump in line to give it that pressure it needs. It's the dual pump setup. You know what I'm talking about? He's got one in the tank and then there's one in line.
So did it start as a carbureted?
No.
Did it start as a carbureted? So he has two high pressure pumps?
Well, the one is not what they call a high pressure pump. It was just...
It's a lift pump.
It's a lift pump. And then the other one pressurizes in line.
Got it.
So...
so that first pump probably only goes to about 7 psi or so maximum, which would feed a carburetor just fine. And then it feeds into the fuel injection pump, which typically will take you up to 60 psi or more.
Yeah, because what I saw in like the Haynes manuals and stuff, that motor, now his truck is an 89 model, so it's one of the beginning stages of that 5.0 plant in that the F-150 from what I understand. And it came from the factory with those two pumps in it, and I'm sure it was to make that adaptation from the factory, if that makes sense,
right,
for that motor out of that style truck. But it adds a little bit of cost too that you have to keep in. It adds a little bit of cost too that you have to keep in mind because now you're using two fuel pumps instead of just one.
Yeah, generally the fuel injection pumps are not good sucking pumps, so you typically want to keep them below the level of the bottom of the fuel tank. If it sits above, which may be the reason for this, if it sits above the fuel tank, it may not be able to suck the fuel out of the tank. It needs to get a good what do you call that?
Siphon?
A good siphon going. That's the word I'm looking for, to keep the pump from smoking itself.
Yeah, and
if those fuel injection pumps, the inline pumps that you mount on the frame rail, if they go dry, they burn up really quickly.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. That pump, the inline pump, burnt itself up because it didn't have enough fuel coming to it through the siphon pump, and that siphon pump had calcified, on the sending unit inside the tank. It was just like all corroded and nasty. So once again, that's something to keep in mind. You may be dealing with just one fuel pump, you may be dealing with two, and they serve the purpose. So you can, in some instances, from what I've read, eliminate one, but you have to make up for it in the other pump, right?
Right. Yeah. If you put that fuel injection pump as close as you can to the fuel tank and as low as possible, hopefully below the bottom of that fuel tank, you should be fine.
Yeah, and see,
you may have to prime it initially, but it'll be fine.
And in instance, this pickup, the fuel sending pump was on top of the tank, so it was siphoning vertically, right, to come out, which of course is more effort. It's working its gravity and all that kind of stuff. So you can use these OEM systems to a fairly high amount of horsepower, typically speaking, especially if it's like a V6 or a V8 style motor and it came from the factory with that kind of fuel sending cell, right? Now, what is it that we can do to kind of protect our fuel systems? Because, I mean, I know that there's all kinds of filters out there that you need or you can choose from as far as like protecting it from trash, because none of this fuel that we put in our tanks is really that clean. I mean,
Right. And even worse is some of the fuel cells that you buy will have that foam. I don't know if you've
mm,
seen it, that foam that's in them that deteriorates, within a year or two, and it starts getting it into the fuel lines and destroys your fuel pump, destroys your injectors. So you need to stop that stuff before it gets to the pump. So typically on an EFI, let's just work with an EFI type system. You'll have a fuel filter before the pump, and then a fuel filter after the pump. Now, the fuel filter that comes before the pump is typically like a 40 micron filter, and then you're going to have the pump. And then after the fuel pump, you're going to want like a 100 micron filter, which will get the tiny particles that would destroy your injectors trapped in there. That's kind of what you want to do.
and so that we are transparent in all this, John. The siphoning systems, or those that are on the side of the tank, typically, you know what I mean, that are sucking out of the tank mount.
They usually just have a sock on
It's
it,
a
right?
sock, and it has
Right.
some micron reading, but I don't really know what
Probably
they are.
something like 10.
Yeah, I would think.
Which is, I think we were talking about it yesterday, which is the size of like a grain of sand.
Okay. And those on some models can be replaced. I know that some models, they're so cheap that you just have to basically buy a new pump, or you have to adapt a sock from another pump onto it if you want to just change
Right,
it.
but that's not a fun job because you either
No.
have to drop the tank or somehow you have to pull that whole unit out of the top of the fuel tank.
So, would you suggest putting another pump if it doesn't come in the system between, like, how would you suggest on an OEM siphon pump? How would you suggest filtering that system?
I would try and avoid running two pumps at all costs if I could. I mean, the only reason that I would try and run two pumps is if I was using one as like a backup, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like a redundant system. The more elements that you add to your vehicle, there's more things that could go wrong. So I would just run a regular fuel injection pump, properly place it, below the fuel tank so it has a good siphon without going dry, and then use a quality pump. Some of these cheap import pumps aren't going to work as well as, say, like a Bosch or something like that.
Now, is there an alternative that and once again, people, I'm asking John because I'm really not up on fuel systems here on a lot of stuff, but like a top mount, because a lot of the pumps from the factory are top mount. So,
Right.
is there some way to get that further down?
Well, generally, that you're talking about that whole system that drops into the top of
Yeah.
the fuel tank. There's actually a fuel pump that's usually about halfway down
Okay.
into the fuel, so the fuel actually cools the pump, which is good. Which that's fine. It's just sometimes you can't take that big fuel sending unit and drop it into a fuel cell, or let's say you want a more high pressure pump. Maybe you can't adapt it to your sending unit. That might not be possible. But there are kits, aftermarket kits, that you can put into a fuel cell or into your fuel tank if you have a nice flat surface to work with.
Okay. So, what about like injectors? Because I know, like, I've talked to a few people who have taken a V6 or something like that, and they're adapting their V6 to be like turboed. And I'm not trying to get into specific applications, but what I'm saying is and then they'll be like, oh well, I looked online and there's this injector out of another V8 or something for my V6 with turbo that'll push that amount of fuel that I need. And they do that. Is that a better option, or is it a better option to go with like a high performance fuel company and try to get a fuel rail that is made for that rating and that you need?
I think it's just going to depend on your application. I mean, at that level, you're going to have an engine tuner that's going to you're going to have to dyno the thing, right?
Mhm.
And you're going to have to make sure that it's not running too lean or too rich. And either it comes in a kit, and they give you the injectors and it's just put these in and you'll be fine, or you're on your own and you're kind of like, I want to put this huge turbo or this huge supercharger on my engine. And if that's the case, like I said, you can go find a guy that's a tuner that can, get you the right computer program and everything for your engine so you don't blow it up. You put bigger injectors into it, of course, it's going to dump more fuel. But if you're working with like a factory application, let's say you took like a stock Jeep Wrangler and you said, oh, I'm going to put bigger injectors in it to try and get it more horsepower. Well, that's not going to do anything for you because the computer's going to negate that. It's going to say, hey, look, I don't need this much fuel because downwind down here in the exhaust, I'm seeing that it's running too rich. So it's going to shorten up the squirt of the injector. Even though you got this bigger injector, you're still putting the same amount of fuel in. So it's not going to really help you. I wouldn't look at it as fuel engine. Maybe people know this or don't, but fuel injectors are not like a performance modification. It's in addition to something. So when you modify a motor, you kind of got to look at it as you got to modify it on both ends. Let's say if you modify the inside, you need to modify the intake and the exhaust.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, well, as we all know, well, I hope you know, if you add more fuel, you got to have more air. So adding more fuel
and a bigger exhaust.
Yeah, and you've got to be able to release that combusted air, that exhaust. So
think of an engine as a pump.
Yeah.
If you're putting more air in on one side, you have to be able to suck more air out the other side.
Yeah, and you have to also add more fuel. But if you just add more fuel and not more air, and you don't have the exhaust to handle it, then it's working against all the effort you're putting into your motor and your vehicle anyway. So, I mean, I do know that much about it. I get that much. Now, let's talk about a little bit about using an OEM fuel system, but for a motor swap. Are there modifications? What kind of modifications are typically available for using a fairly OEM fuel system with a different motor? Like,
so generally,
go ahead.
So generally, when you're working with let's say an older vehicle that was a carbureted engine, then and you want to switch it over to a newer engine that's fuel injected, you can use the factory fuel tank, which there may be no other option to fit in your vehicle, and you don't actually have a sending unit that drops down into the top of the fuel tank. It may not be possible to do that. So you can put an inline fuel pump, say like a pretty common part number is an E2000. You can go to any parts store and it's it's $100 and $120 fuel pump that's inline, and like I said, you run it with the correct filters and everything, and you put it in the correct location, and you can run a fuel injected motor off of your factory fuel tank. Now you'll have to run a return line back from the engine on most of these engines, and you can plumb it in many different ways. If you need to drill and tap a fitting into the tank, you could have a welding shop braze weld the tank fitting onto the tank, or another easy way is just to feed it back into the fill tube.
Yeah. Now there is a note I would like to make, and it's not specifically about the fuel system there, but what you mentioned about how to work the fuel system back into the return. Do not MIG or arc weld your fuel tank. It's a very bad
certainly
idea.
Not with fuel in it. Yeah, don't do that.
Do not do that. In fact, I very short story. I know a guy in Chile that was trying to weld a fuel tank that they had washed out with gas, with soap, and it still had enough residue of the fuel in there that it caught fire. With a fairly,
or in some cases it'll just blow up.
Yeah, and if he hadn't had washed it out with soap, it would have blown up. But because he already tried, there were still enough fumes in there to really cause an ignite. Now that's because fuel actually does kind of seep into the metal to a small degree as well. It's hard to get it out. It takes longer than just washing it out real quick. So be very, very cautious with that. I've known people to weld diesel fuel tanks full of diesel with a stick welder. Bad idea as well. But I've known people to do it. That's just because diesel doesn't light, as quickly. It takes a higher flame or
higher flash point. Yeah.
But once again, brazing it is best as somebody who has experience with it. I've known some people. Do you suggest this, John? I've known some people to use basically what is it? I don't think it's JB weld, but they use one of those liquid weld kind of things to.
Yeah, I typically try and not go directly into the tank. The only time that I would go directly into the tank is sometimes the tanks are made out of that polyethylene, and it's really thick. And you can drill and tap that stuff, no problem. While it's in the vehicle, while there's fuel in it, and you find a thick corner on the tank, just drill your hole, tap it, run a fitting into it, and that's perfect. If you need to run a return line on, say, like a steel tank, I would try and recommend someone go in through the fuel filler nozzle. You can easily build an adapter just out of a piece of tubing, and you can weld something to that tubing, and then after you're done, and then insert it into the fill tube after you're done. And that way you're not welding anywhere near the tank, and all you're doing is cutting your fuel filler hose and splicing in a coupler that has a fitting for the return line.
Okay, now let's just go worst case. Well, in either case, right? The fuel return through the filler or in the tank itself. Let's say that you've tapped it like that. What do you suggest? Do you suggest using like Teflon tape around the threads to do it, or do you suggest one of the threaded nipples that has that rubber gasket?
I don't like using those rubber gaskets because that rubber is eventually going to go bad. I would use Teflon tape, but make sure it doesn't get down into the tank and stuff. Because, I mean, you're going to have a filter and everything, but you don't want that Teflon tape to get into your injectors or your fuel pump because it'll ruin it.
Okay.
So, use it sparingly.
All right. So we talked about the option of using the OEM system injectors and that kind of stuff, but with the fuel cell because you want the space. But that space really comes at a price, right? I mean, because a fuel cell is only a portion of the price.
Yeah, well, you're taking up a lot of space inside the vehicle, number one, right? Like if you have a rear seat or something, you might have to find a fuel cell that's narrow that fits in the back or whatever. But yeah, it's only a small portion of the price because you got to buy all the fittings that actually work on those fuel cells. They typically come with AN style fittings on them, and generally they're -8, which is way bigger than most enthusiast 4x4s need. That's a half-inch feed line is a -8. So generally you'll have to neck it down to like a -6 generally, and that would take you into a 3/8 feed line.
So you also have to consider space because every adapter takes up a little bit more space, and if you're in a tight area, you might have to find an adapter that's a 90 or something if you can, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it sounds simple, and the theory of it, the logic of it is simple, but the actual application can get really complicated depending on what you're using, where you're placing it, what your uses are of your vehicle as well, right?
Right, and the cost of the fittings adds up really quick. So like when you're dealing with say like a -8 AN style fitting, you're most of them are around $20 each. So you need to go. There's 3 fittings on the top of your fuel cell, right? You've got the vent, you've got the feed line, and then you've got the return line. So now you've got to adapt all 3 of those lines to whatever hose you're trying to use. And quickly you're over $100 in fittings very easily. One way to make it a little less expensive is if you don't mind using steel. You can go to like a local auto parts store that sells hydraulic lines and things like that, and you can find steel AN fittings that'll work for that.
What about using hard line that's what do they call that on the end? Trumpeted or whatever?
It has a ferrule.
Yeah, it has the ferrule on the end of it.
Ferrule. Yet you're still going to have to buy the AN fittings that convert to that. And actually, that's what I'm doing on my flat fenders. I'm going from a -8 to a steel 3/8 hard line.
Okay.
But you're still buying 2 fittings. You got to buy the 90 that comes off the tank, and then you got to buy the adapter that goes from that -8 to the steel hard line.
Now, how are you bending your hard line? Do you? I know some people who say they heat it and they bend it, or some people just say they cold bend it by hand, and some people use a tool to bend it. How are you bending yours?
The tool, the bender for that is really inexpensive. I think I have I actually have 2 different tools that do it, but it's a $10 or $15 tool. It's not worth trying to do it by hand where you're going to kink it and things. So just go buy the tool.
Yeah, I've done it for brakes, right? Not for fuel system, but for brakes. And I will say that using that hard line, if you bend it by hand and then you mess up your bend and you try to bend it back, it's going to snap. It's very thin gauge. It's soft still, so do not try to overbend and adjust too much that tubing, and you will need the tool to, what is that? What'd you call that at the end?
The flare.
Yeah,
that puts a flare.
That puts that flare in it to hold the fitting so that you can screw it on. So keep that in mind as well.
Tool. Yeah, I actually have a really nice flaring tool. It's a hand-operated hydraulic one that you can do all kinds of different fittings on it. You can do the GM style fuel injection fittings.
Dang, he's got a hydraulic one. What? I told you he was
hammer
rich.
And chisel like you. But
I told you he was rich.
Oh, God.
No, but those are really important. I've used the hand operated one that's like it's a clamp. You put the tube in it, and then it has a pin that screws in and it presses on it.
There's less expensive versions of that tool, and then there's a higher quality version of that tool. Some of them can't clamp the tubing tight enough, and it'll just push it right through if you buy the cheapy tool. But it works. The one thing that I've learned about those is don't try and over flare it. Usually, if you try and flare it more than you need to, it makes the flare too large and it doesn't fit inside the fitting. So it's something you're going to want to experiment with, if the tool's new to you.
Yeah, and I suggest, like John said, cut a little piece off of extra and play with it, and try to get it working right. And also get a good quality hand one if you're using the manual ones like John said, because some of them will just, it doesn't hold. It just pushes the tube right out the other side. And all you'll
Right.
do is get frustrated. It's not worth saving the $5 or $10 that they are. Even if it's
Right.
$15 cheaper, just get a good one. And just know that there are two kinds of those hand flare ones. There's the one that makes it do like that, right? It's kind of like an
There's several
acorn.
different flares, right? I think
Yeah.
there's a 37 degree, which is the standard AN, and then there's a 45 degree flare as well.
Okay, because I know that there's the ones that make it fold over like that, and then the holes in the center, and then there's the one that make it look like a trumpet.
So there's a double flare. There's a double flare, and then there's the just the regular single flare, which is be like what you'd use in your house for water supply or something.
Is there one that's really? I mean, do they both work for fuel, or is there one you're?
I wouldn't want to use the home style one. You want to use like the double flare.
So the double
type.
flare is the one that makes it look like a little
Where it
acorn.
rolls,
on
actually,
there?
it's a two procedure process, right? So it actually rolls the bead over and it seals on two sides. So it seals on the inside that looks like the trumpet, and then it seals on the outside as well.
Okay, I've never used
And
that
that's
one.
what you use on brake lines.
Yeah, I've used the one that makes it look like that, because it stops the tube from going out, and then it presses the outside of the tube inward slightly, and it.
So as a bubble flare,
It's a
like
bubble
a VW
flare.
brake line?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's the
Yeah,
only
those
one.
aren't very common for most traditional 4x4s.
Okay, so once again, this is why I'm talking to John. Make sure that you kind of keep in mind what he's talking about, the double-sided flare that seals it really well, and that's a good idea to go with when you're trying to do your fuel system that you're building. Well, let's see. We've gone over the OEM systems, right? Pretty much. We've done the adapting to a fuel cell, because you've got the cost of the fuel cell, which is only the beginning. Then you've got all your adapter pieces. If you're adapting to a OEM fuel system, you still got to get your filters for that stuff, which is even more important because of, like John was saying, the styrofoam and that kind of junk that'll deteriorate in there, right?
Yeah, inside the fuel tank, that foam. I typically, that foam that comes in the fuel cells, some of those fuel cells, is I'll just pull that stuff out first thing.
Okay.
That foam is in there to try and control slosh and to keep the fuel from misting inside the tank. Unless you have some sort of race requirement that requires you to have that in your tank, you really probably don't want to keep it in there.
Okay. And then you have the full-on race system, which we're talking about high pressure lines and that are pretty thick.
You know, you're talking about huge, giant lines that are, -8 and bigger.
Which
that
just
are
in the
feeding a
line
motor.
alone, you're going to spend how much money? I mean,
A lot of money, several dollars
Yeah.
per feet, per foot.
so I mean, and if you're running just a stock motor or a slightly modified motor, even if it's a big V8, that's overkill. You're never going to use the full potential of what that system can give you.
You can generally get by most applications. You're going to be able to get by with 3/8 feed line.
Yeah. I mean, I would assume that race style system is for like 800 and higher horsepower.
I'd be guessing, but yeah.
I mean,
I'd
I'm
say
saying
somewhere around
assuming.
the 700 horsepower is when you're starting to get into the -8 fittings.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? A lot of the King of the Hammer kind of guys they were running, or the desert racers.
Some of them are running motors that are up to that.
Yeah, like the
they're
top end
probably
guys.
running -8 fittings.
So I think they're running like 800 like a range of 600 to 800.
There's probably a handful of guys that are running 8, but that's a pretty high number.
But you don't see. I mean, in off-roading, you don't really see people that are running 1,000, 1,200 horsepower. Really,
You lose a lot of reliability when you get up into those numbers.
Yeah. Okay. Because I mean, well, if you want to call it, they say it's off-road too, but you know what I mean, like track racing, like those guys run
Circle track guys?
no, like car, like drag racing, or you know what I mean,
Oh, okay.
road racing. Because technically it's off-road as well, right? Because you can't be on street.
Yeah, okay, let's call it in the dirt then.
Yeah, but you see what I'm saying? Those guys, they're running 1,200 horsepower, some of them or whatnot, trying to get that ultimate. But I mean, they're not stuck out in the middle of the desert if their car breaks down either. You know what I mean? So,
Right. Yeah, they're trying to go a quarter mile at a time.
Yeah, and
that's a little different than trying to keep your vehicle alive for 1,000 miles, or
Yeah.
or actually just using it as a recreational 4x4.
yeah, and I mean today a lot of those guys run that stuff for drifting, because they want that power to get their tires broke loose from the track. But once again, they're on a track that's just right there. I mean, off-road, as far as dirt, right, racing, a lot of times the tracks like the Mint 400, for instance, or King of the Hammers, or um, Baja, that kind of stuff. Those guys, they're on the track, but the track is how big? I mean, if they break
Yeah.
down, they're just out there. So not a good idea. Or if you're doing trails like the Rubicon or any of those up there, Winch Hill. What is Winch Hill on? Is that?
I don't.
I can't remember the name of it. But all of that kind of stuff, it's like you don't want to get stuck out there because your fuel system didn't.
Right. Yeah. Generally, you're just not going to have to deal with that kind of a problem with a recreational 4x4. You're not going to see that many guys running anything more than 600 horsepower. That's a lot.
Yeah.
600 horsepower is a lot.
It does a lot
for a recreational 4x4.
Yeah. I mean, and that's only the guys that are really racing. I mean, if you're doing more crawling and stuff, that amount of horsepower isn't really that necessary because you're more into your gear reduction and all that kind of stuff. So
it can become a detriment for some styles of, like, if you're wanting to crawl over rocks and stuff, to run a 600 horsepower, it's usually making that power at a higher RPM, and to do that you're going to have to run a high stall converter, and that's just not going to work very well for a lot of off-roading unless you're going mud bogging or something like that, but that's a totally different animal.
So best case scenario for most of us, run an OEM system slightly modified if needed, right?
If you need a fuel cell, if you want the
need
convenience of putting the fuel container where you want it and the size that you want, then a fuel cell makes sense. But don't think you need to convert over a fuel cell as a performance modification.
Now, this isn't directly related to fuel systems, right? But it does relate directly to fuel tanks, right? So, like, using a fuel cell is for, like you said, the convenience. But what would make that convenience worth it? Like clearance under the truck? In your opinion?
Yeah, definitely for clearance. Like I was telling you, if you're wanting to extend the wheelbase on an older Jeep that has the fuel tank in the rear, that axle is going to run right into the fuel tank. So you got to move the fuel tank somewhere else. Easiest way to do that is to get a fuel cell and put it inside the vehicle, or maybe you get a fuel cell that's a little thinner than your fuel tank, and you could still keep it underneath the vehicle. Cut a hole in the top of the body and kind of drop it down in.
Yeah.
You have a lot more options with fuel cells because there's so many sizes that are available.
Well, I don't know, and I haven't done much research. I don't know what other vehicles are out there that are like this, but I do know that, like on the Isuzu Rodeos, I think it is, they're top link on the axle because it's a linked axle on coil springs, right? If you lift your truck and you start to run a more articulating system, the top link has a tendency to hit the bottom of the fuel tank for the factory.
Okay.
So in that instance, you can either bend a link, which you have to calculate really well, or you might want to go a fuel cell to move it out of the way. And that's the kind of applications we're talking about, or like John said, extending the axle further back than it originally was, because then it might move in a vertical application that would hit the tank or whatever. And you do not want to puncture your tank.
Yeah.
Or even dent it so bad that the fuel sending cell inside gets crimped and doesn't send like it should either. So don't be cautious is all I'd say. Don't be cheap if you're going to do all this other work and not get what you need in your fuel system just because you didn't want to spend a few dollars on a different style tank or a fuel cell when that's what you really need, because all it's going to do is cause you more money in the future. I mean, if you crimp a fuel pump to where it doesn't send, or if you puncture a hole in your tank, I've seen them catch on fire because fuel drips on the exhaust, and it'll start a fire. I mean, and you can lose a lot more money trying to save a few dollars than just spending the money you need for the fuel system. Do you agree with that? I mean,
Yeah, I usually try and not mess around with fuel systems. Spend the money up front, do a quality job. Don't rinky-jink hoses together, use old cracked hoses or any of that. Use real quality components whenever you can.
What about body armor for fuel tanks under the truck or rig? Is that a good solution to you? Like, the plate that they put on to protect them from hits?
Yeah, I mean, if it's in a location where it has a potential to get damaged, then yeah, you probably should build some sort of skid plate. And usually, any type of steel back there, it'd be a good way to go. Yeah.
I've seen them 1/4 inch, I've seen them 5/16, and I've seen them 1/8. So or 3/16. I mean, I'm sorry, not 5/16. So it's kind of up to
Depends
you.
on the
Yeah.
application and how you use it. I mean, if you're in the rocks a lot, then yeah, you're going to want a thicker skid plate. But it depends on how you drive the Jeep and or how vehicle and where you plan on going.
Yeah, you might lose a few miles per gallon, but because of extra weight when you're protecting this kind of stuff, but it's worth it in the end. I mean, it really is. And please do not lift your vehicle by the gas tank. Don't put the jack under the gas tank and lift your vehicle. Please.
Yeah, don't do that.
Please.
Yeah, the only time there should be a jack under your gas tank is if you're lowering the tank out to change out a fuel pump or something.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother story. I had a friend help me out one day, and he was like, "I'll lift it," and I walk away. I'm like, "Okay," and I come back, and the whole back of the Troopers like hung off the gas tank, and I'm like,
Did it bend the gas tank up?
no. Thankfully enough, he put it right at the back of the gas tank where it makes the curve. Which, if and I'm not suggesting this, I'm not suggesting it, but if in some weird emergency you have to lift your vehicle by the gas tank,
That should never happen.
but if it does, think about how you have to do it. Make sure you do it on a bend or something. I'm saying, do not do it. That is what I'm saying. But if, because I never thought that would be a need, but living in Chile, I found a couple of situations where that was the only option. So
Terrible.
I know it's horrible. I know, but hey, what do you do?
Right.
I mean, what do you do? It's just what it is. Because nobody out there even owns a high lift. I think I'm the only person I know that owns a high lift. So everybody else has like these, like
A screw jack or something.
well, hold on. This isn't related to fuel systems at all. We're going off on a tangent here, but it's funny, right? So I decide, oh look, my trackpad battery is low. Okay. What happened was I found a bunch of guys who had these like little, not scissor jacks, but like floor jacks, right?
Uh-huh.
And they're like miniature 3-ton, whatever 2-ton floor jacks. And I was like, man, those are kind of convenient for certain things. I mean, they're easy to lift up your axle and whatever to change the tire or whatnot. Well, come to find out, this 1.5-ton floor jack cost $8.
Oh, wow.
So you can imagine the quality of this jack, right? So
Right. You don't want to get under the vehicle. with
yeah,
that.
definitely not. So I bought one just as like a reserve to my reserve because I'm out there by myself and I have like a hydraulic cylinder jack, right?
Uh-huh.
And I drove around with it for 6 months, never used it. I opened the box one day just to check it and see how it was because I like to review my equipment. And all the nuts that hold the casters on had come loose and the casters were like all falling off of it and
Did it come with oil?
yeah, it came with oil, but half of it had leaked out because the
wow.
jack is on its side and it was leaking out the seal by the piston. And I was like, wow,
$8 will get you a lot. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, yeah. So I just threw it out, and it never got used, and I just threw it out. So get a good jack. I mean, just get a good jack. Don't.
Right.
I'm a big proponent. What is it? Not proponent. Proponent, is that the word?
Probably. Sure.
Yeah, I'm someone who really encourages getting at least a good quality bottle jack to carry around with you if you don't have a high lift or if you don't have bumpers for that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Too bad you don't follow that mantra with the rest of your tools.
Hey, shut up. What are you talking about? My tools are good. What's wrong with what's wrong with my tools? Tell me what's wrong with my tools.
Well, maybe that's another episode we need to look at. These are Eric's tools. Let's all make fun of him.
Oh man. So are you saying my arc welder is bad?
I haven't seen it yet, so it's suspect. It's definitely suspect.
No, my arc welder is good. My MIG welder was bad, but that's sold.
Who builds the arc welder you got?
It's a company called Endura. They sell them in Spain, and it's European designed. It works really good.
Yeah, so does a Peugeot car.
I haven't had any problems with my Endura. There are other companies in Chile that I am very suspect of. I was very suspect of Endura for a while too, but most of the ship manufacturers in Chile actually use Endura, and that's the only one that they'll use that's Latin made. So,
Huh.
but The other ones, they're like, no.
That's fine. Your other tools are suspect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my other tools are Makita, DeWalt, Black & Decker.
Well, you're just calling people out left and right.
Thanks.
Yeah, say goodbye to that sponsorship.
It was nice knowing you for the 2 minutes. Shoot, man. If they ever find me, this episode will be long forgotten and they'll never know about it anyway. I mean, what? I have five listeners that are going to tune into this, and one of them's your mom because you said, "Hi, Mom."
Right,
So,
exactly.
Whatever. Does any of this relate to fuel systems?
Nope, not at all.
Welcome to John Cappa in my life. Every time we get on the phone. Well, I would like to tell you, when was it I called you yesterday?
Yeah,
I called John yesterday, and my wife laughed because I had the phone on speaker. It's just easier to hear, and he says, "What's up, my problem child?" So, that's the kind of friendship we have. Anything else on fuel systems that you can think of that need to be mentioned?
I think we covered it pretty good. And we got adapter, adapting an engine, and we got filtering, fuel cells. There's a couple of different fuel cells that you can get. You can get the plastic ones, you can get the steel ones. There's different types. It just depends, what's going to work for your application.
The difference between the plastic and the steel basically are, in a very broad sense, just the weights and stuff, right? And durability as far as impact and that kind of stuff.
No, the steel one is actually it's a plastic one with a steel shell around it. So yeah, it's better for impact. Sometimes it's easier to mount. It actually looks better than the plastic one. The plastic ones will sometimes kind of collapse in on themselves, and they kind of look, I don't know, less clean.
Okay.
The ones that I've been using lately are the TIG welded aluminum ones. Now you got to be careful how you mount those. I typically just use a strap that wraps around it and clamps it down.
To the floor.
You don't want to use any of the ears that bolt to that are welded to the side of the aluminum tanks, because if you bolt it down to, say, like sheet metal, and that sheet metal flexes like this, then it'll tear the tank apart.
Okay. What about making your own? I mean, I've seen some guys who fiberglass some together. Is that pretty?
That's a viable option. To me,
it's a lot of work.
I look at it as, your time's worth something, and so if you want to spend that much time cutting aluminum, or if you need a specific size, you can cut aluminum and weld it together. You can fiberglass something together. But the reality is there's so many tanks out there, from the boat market, from racing market, that, if you can't find something that's going to work for you, then maybe you need to change where you want to put it, the fuel tank.
Yeah, honestly, unless it's like a super, super specific application, right? That's like super custom to you. Making your own fuel cell isn't really worth it, because
it's not really cost
effective. The fiberglass or the aluminum or the welding or the finish work and all that stuff, when you start adding all that up plus your time, it's going to cost you a lot more than just buying a factory one that, or a custom one even, that's made from
the only time that makes sense is if you have a race vehicle, or you're trying to fit every last gallon you possibly can in this vehicle, and that's when that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's something else to kind of keep in mind with all that kind of stuff. But that's just how it goes. Other than that, though, I think we've covered it. I think
sounds good.
We're pretty good. Oh, make sure your fuel systems stay clean. Do not leave gas in them for long periods of time. If it's in there for over a couple, how long does fuel stay good these days?
I think it depends on where you're at and what the fuel is. Some places maybe 3 months, some places 6 months, a year. I've walked up to vehicles that have sat for 2 years and start them up and they start fine. So it just really depends if the fuel is being contaminated with water or anything else, into the system. So it just depends. There's no set rule. If it doesn't smell like fuel, then it's probably not fuel anymore. If it smells more like, turpentine or something like that.
Or varnish or something like that.
Yeah, like a varnish, then you need to probably drain it out and put fresh fuel in.
My dad's truck sat for a while, and I opened up the gas tank, the filler, and it was like pure turpentine in there. I was like, ooh. And so you start, and that's another thing. If it's set for a while, you need to check it, because I opened it up and I smelt it. We realized that the fuel pump was bad. We knew that to begin with. That's why it set so long. We dropped the tank and all that stuff, and I started looking at the fuel lines, and all the fuel lines were clogged. They had they get this like really sticky, gooey kind of residue inside them. And over time, if you don't watch it, they will actually start to deteriorate some of the rubber hosing that they use for the fuel
Right.
system. So fuel passing through rubber doesn't do it much harm, right? From what I can tell, it's the fuel sitting
Well,
in
you
it
got to
for a
use the
long
right
time.
fuel lines, right? You
Yeah,
got to use
but I mean,
rated lines that are for fuel. And the real problem has turned out in the U.S. at least. I don't know what you guys do in Chile, but in the U.S. the addition of ethanol into fuel has destroyed traditional rubber brake line, or sorry, fuel lines. So you have to use special fuel lines now that are that can hold up to the ethanol.
Okay, so just another tip for you guys to think about. I know a lot of this stuff we repeat and we say not because we don't think you know it, but it's just to help you remember when you're working on your fuel system. It's easy to get so focused on the major components that some of these details, it's easy to forget. Like I actually had to disconnect the fuel lines to go and clean them out because I forgot to do it. I thought I needed to do that, but then I got busy doing everything else on my dad's system that when it came time, I just wanted it done, and I plugged them all up, and I was like, dang, now I got to go back and unplug these things and clean them, you know. So
Right.
that's
Usually it's easier just to replace the plastic or the rubber lines. And if it's metal and it's rusty inside, you're probably going to want to replace those rather than clean them out as well.
And depending on where you live, if the lines start to rust and you see pitting on them, probably a good idea to change them.
Swap them out.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's just some opinions of two guys that nobody listens to anyway. So.
Or at least one, right?
Yeah, well, everybody listens to John, I know.
Oh, jeez. Here we go.
I mean, I call him up in the morning. I'm trying to get him to fix his hair so he'll talk to me. I'm trying to boost John's career by having him on my show, and I can't even get him to talk to me.
Yeah, it was like 1 o'clock, and he expects me to be out of my pajamas? Really? Come on.
So,
what kind of lifestyle I live over
well,
here?
I mean, from what I understand, you go to bed at 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. and you wake up at 4.
Well, that's a party night, man. We're talking like
and you wake up at 4 a.m. So I figured you would have been, already up and watching, I don't know, The View or something.
No.
So.
Oh, you kill you.
I kill myself. Yes, I did. So, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. That's all we got for you today. I mean, me and John could sit here and rag each other a little while longer, but I can do that without you guys listening in. So we're going to say bye. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show again, John. I do appreciate it. It's always a good time with you on the show.
Someone's got to pay your bills.
Well, you ain't doing it, so who's the someone?
I'm not your sugar daddy.
Dang it, man. I thought he was. No, but don't forget, guys, please stop by all the sites. You can stop by Facebook and check me out on Off-Road Independence. My name, Eric McGrew, on Facebook as well. You can find me through that. You can find me through offroadindependence.com. I have beginnersfab.com, which you probably won't learn anything there anyway, so why even bother going by? And you can also go by Zazzle.com and check out some of my stuff at Zazzle.com/offroad independence. I think it's offroad_independence. But you probably won't want to buy any of those designs either. So I don't know why you'd go buy that.
Actually, you had some cool stuff there. You actually had some cool stuff
well,
there.
John says I have some cool stuff. He won't do it, so I'm going to. I'm going to take a screenshot of his face and print it on my shirt and say, I'm a John Cappa fan. And maybe you guys will buy that for me.
No one will buy it. No one.
I think you'd be surprised.
Not even my mom.
I think you'd be surprised.
Okay.
So, if you guys have any questions, you can definitely send me messages through Facebook. Feel free to do that. You can send me any kind of message on any of my social media. On the video that you'll be watching on YouTube, you can put stuff in the comments if you want. I know John.
Especially if you have a topic that you want us to cover.
Yeah, please do. I would love to hear. I'd love to have more feedback, man. I mean, people aren't. I'm not complaining about them. It's just I haven't gotten much feedback, so I don't know what they expect. You know what I mean from us, from me. John isn't technically a co-host of the show because he's not always on, but we do get together and put our schedules together so that we can cover certain topics if that's what you guys want. I mean, he's been real helpful in that, and that's not to put you down, John, as not being a co-host. It's just you come on regularly. It's just not. I don't want people to think, oh well.
I'm insulted.
I don't want people to think, oh well, now John Cappa's a co-host to Off-Road Independence. That would never work. I have to say though, John, I'm very proud of you. You've learned how to use Skype in the video so that we can actually
And the
talk.
internet.
Yeah, the internet. It's great. No, but thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody. And if you need anything, just let us know. And I hope to see you guys in the next episode. So have a good day and be safe out there wheeling.